The committee will come to order, and good afternoon to everyone. Today's hearing is intended to examine the challenges faced by the nations of Africa's Sahel region, especially the spread of both terrorism and trafficking in the entire area. These problems alone pose a danger to the security of both the Sahel and developed countries, not only because of air traffic to West African that transit in northern Mali, but also because of the use of the region as a base of attacks by Islamic extremists on Western targets. Moreover, the pre-existing humanitarian crisis is now worsened, and as are human rights concerns. The underlying political instability is becoming equally serious. We are holding this joint hearing as a joint session because of the threat that we face goes beyond the jurisdiction of any one of our subcommittees. It involves not only Africa's Sahel region, but also countries in North Africa, especially Algeria and Libya. It also involves terrorist groups originating from and based in nations outside of the Sahel. It is a sign of how seriously the Foreign Affairs Committee considers this matter that our three subcommittees have come together to consider this matter today. There are various definitions of the Sahel, but for the purposes of this hearing, we do mean the nations of Senegal, Mauritania, Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, and Chad. In early 2012, the government of Mali was overthrown, as we all know, in a military coup, and subsequently lost control of the northern area of the country, which constitutes more than half of its land area. Mali had long been considered a stable example of African democracy, but as we learned in our subcommittee's hearing in June of 2012, the coup and resulting loss of so much territory revealed a hollowness and a rot within the Mali democratic system. The influx of well-armed terrorist groups, broken promises to neglected ethnic groups, lack of adherence to democratic principles, and rampant drug smuggling all made the Mali government vulnerable to breakdown. We must ask now whether other countries in Africa's Sahel region are also more vulnerable than we think. Mali provided a staging ground for al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, or AQIM, which is daily becoming an ever greater threat in the region and perhaps globally. AQIM is considered the best funded of all al-Qaeda affiliates, and through its ties to other terrorist groups, may be funding their activities as well. In a July subcommittee hearing last year, we learned that Boko Haram in Nigeria is not a unified organization, but rather various factions, some of which are focused on embarrassing the Nigerian government, but others that have a more global jihadist view. It is the latter that we have had present in northern Mali and pose a threat to Western interests, not to mention the interests of the Mali people. Boko Haram attacks led Nigerian President Goodluck Jonathan last week to declare a state of emergency in 3 northern states in his country. A radical Boko Haram splinter group known as Ansaru may have attacked Nigerian troops en route to a peacekeeping operation in Mali. In Mali, 3 terrorist groups dominate the rebellion that split off the north. Moujwa, a splinter group of AQIM, Ansar al-Din, an Islamic Tuareg rebel group, and the MNLA, a more secular Tuareg group. These groups have different aims and sometimes clash with one another. Nevertheless, they collectively oppose and continue to pose a threat to the peace in Mali and the region. As a result of the rebel actions in northern Mali, there are currently more than 300,000 internally displaced persons in Mali, more than 74,000 refugees in Mauritania, 50,000 refugees in Niger, and nearly 50,000 refugees in Burkina Faso. The displacement of nearly 500,000 Malians strain already scarce resources in the Sahel, with aid recipients often in remote areas. French forces, as we know as well, were able to forestall a rebel advance in southern Mali earlier this year, and an African military contingent is in the process of being deployed to Mali even now. However, chasing rebels out of Mali's major northern towns will be easier than ending ongoing terrorist attacks or reconciling ethnic groups whose enmity has grown over the year. We look forward to today's witness witnesses, I should say. All of them, and our two witnesses from the administration, thank you for being here, and I'll properly introduce you in a moment, but thank you for your leadership. It is making a huge difference. I'd like to now yield to my good friend and colleague, Ms. Bass, for an
As always, thank you, Chairman Smith, for holding this hearing today. I was pleased yesterday to see the formal announcement of President Obama's upcoming visit to the continent next month. I know we're here today to discuss the Sahel, a vast region that stretches from the Atlantic Ocean to the Red Sea. Each of the nations in the region experience a unique set of challenges, which, as we know, make developing effective and far-reaching programs extraordinarily difficult. While the crisis in Mali was spiraling out of control, a humanitarian crisis was underway that affected tens of millions of people throughout the region. The UN's 2013 Sahel Regional Strategy amply illustrates the immense challenge experienced by those living in the Sahel and nations like our own who have the resources and desire to make a difference. The report notes that some of the key drivers to the humanitarian crisis include food insecurity, epidemic disease, floods, locust infestation, and the continued crisis in Mali and the displacement of populations, both internally and those who continue to seek refuge in Mali's neighboring countries. With an estimated need of nearly $2 billion, CRS reports that the UN Consolidated Appeals Process will bring aid organizations together to coordinate a response to major humanitarian crises and disasters and appeal for funds through a collaborative and coordinated plan. I'm pleased that Nancy Limborg from USAID will be here to discuss the administration's new resilience strategy, which was launched late last year and is a promising program that I believe will fundamentally change the way we think about development, particularly in regions and in countries that endure repeated cycles of shock. The resilience strategy makes sense when you consider the key drivers to these humanitarian crises. While the challenges are great, there is a window of opportunity that can be seized upon. If we work within nations and collaborate effectively with donors, the resources available can be used to save lives and prevent decline in the living conditions of millions of infants, expected mothers, and those that require assistance of some sort. Mr. Chairman, today and tomorrow there's a delegation from Mali, a country that has been the focus of this committee's attention, will visit the Congress. I believe you've already had a chance to meet with them. This delegation, led by the President of Mali's National Assembly, is here to discuss their upcoming presidential election, now slated for July 28th. The security challenges that remain in the north of the country and opportunities toward economic development, including a focus on expanding the country's fragile infrastructure. As members of the committee are likely aware, yesterday the UN announced the appointment of a special envoy who will assist in helping Mali regain political stability and security in its vast north. And last week, the country was able to secure over $4 billion in pledges from donor nations to assist in peace and stability efforts and reconstruction of failing infrastructure. With these important announcements and the transition of the African-led international support mission to a UN peacekeeping force, I believe these are positive steps that will ensure a Malian future that is both peaceful and prosperous. I want to close by retelling a story. In late February, I traveled to Mali to see firsthand the many efforts underway that would return Mali to a model democracy for the region and the continent. The CODEL that I was on included Senators Coons and Isaacson, as well as Representative Sewell. We had a chance to meet with displaced families from Timbuktu who spoke of their desire to return to their homes. They sought to return home not merely because that was where they were from, but because they wanted to return home to vote. They wanted to cast their ballots to show the world that the people from Mali themselves seek peace, stability, and a return to normalcy. Our nation is helping to make this a reality, and we should continue to do so throughout the Sahel, a region that greatly requires our attention and support. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ranking Member. I'd like to, before I go to Chairwoman Ros-Lehtinen, just introduce to all assembled Yoni Turi, who is the Speaker of the Mali Assembly, and thank you. You and your delegation are very welcome to this hearing, and I appreciated the time earlier that we had together. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to now yield to my good friend and colleague, former chair of the full committee, now chair of the Middle East and North Africa, Ileana Ros-Lehtinen.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your steadfast leadership for many decades on this important topic. We have been following the developments in this region closely, but the growing crisis in North Africa and the Sahel has been a largely underemphasized threat to U.S. national security interests. For far too long, U.S. foreign policy has been focused on fighting terrorist groups like al-Qaeda in Afghanistan and the Middle East, yet we have looked away from the serious and growing threats coming from North Africa and the Sahel. These areas have become breeding grounds of extremist activity as these nations face many internal struggles, political instability, from dangerous droughts that are wiping out entire villages, to food shortages, human rights concerns, and domestic conflicts. This leaves large swaths of land ungoverned, and their borders are porous and easy to cross undetected. This fragility gives these extremist groups like al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, AQIM, Boko Haram, Ansar al-Din, and others the ability to roam freely in the most lawless region, setting up safe havens for terrorist activities and doing their dirty work, kidnapping, drug trafficking, arms trafficking. And this became evident in the fallout of the Arab Spring as Gaddafi fell and arms and fighters from Libya spread throughout the region. As Secretary Clinton said when she testified before us in January, there is no doubt that the Algerian terrorists had weapons from Libya. There is no doubt that the remnants of AQIM in Mali have weapons from Libya. The weak governments in North Africa and the Sahel don't have the will nor the capacity to confront these extremist groups, and that leaves the United States and our interests extremely vulnerable. The administration has yet to develop a plan or even recognize the severity of the threat. In his push to end the war in Afghanistan, the president justifies a withdrawal because he believes that, as he has repeatedly stated, that we are close to our goal of defeating al-Qaeda, that we have decimated al-Qaeda. Yet al-Qaeda is still as great a threat as ever and is expanding. We see them in North Africa. We see them in the Sahel. They are fighting in Syria. I guess they didn't get the same memo the president received. We have seen a disturbing alliance between drug traffickers and these terrorist groups in the region, allowing the terrorists to develop new resources to finance their illicit activities, while at the same time undermining those governments and our U.S. national security interests. Just last month, we saw a direct narco-terrorism link between African nations and the FARC, a U.S.-designated foreign terrorist organization. Several top figures from Guinea-Bissau's military, including the head of its armed forces and former head of the Navy, were arrested on cocaine and weapons trafficking charges. Both were accused of agreeing to store tons of cocaine and buying weapons for the FARC. These criminal activities undermine our security in our hemisphere and to provide the financing capabilities to terrorists. The administration needs to come to the realization that we are a long way still from defeating al-Qaeda and its influence. To confront these threats, we need a strategy that disrupts the operations of extremist networks, that denies them safe havens, and prevents an escalation of emerging threats by also targeting precursor conditions that foment instability. I look forward, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Bass, to our witnesses today. Thank you so much for convening this timely hearing.
Thank you very much, Chairwoman Ros-Lehtinen. Chair now recognizes the Ranking Member of the Middle East and North Africa Committee, Mr. Deutsch.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing on an issue that, while it may not make the top headlines on a regular basis, certainly has significant implications on the security of the African continent and implications for stability throughout the Middle East. The current environment in the Sahel is precarious and worrisome. The proliferation of militant armed groups in the region, many of which have ties to al-Qaeda in the Maghreb, pose debilitating threats to a region with a history of instability. The partnership and coordination of these radical groups can and has turned smaller domestic disputes into full-blown regional crises. With social and commercial networks traversing over state lines, the porous borders between countries allow for easy and unregulated movement of militant groups, arms, drugs, and other contraband that weaken nations and put populations at risk. The ongoing conflict in Mali exemplifies the trouble that these non-state armed groups can cause, not only to a country's security and safety of their civilians, but to the greater Sahel region as well. We're seeing how quickly a previously stable democratic government can deteriorate, heading toward the likes of Somalia. Thus far in Mali, our approach has been one of limited engagement by bolstering French and UN forces with intelligence and other forms of assistance. In the short term, intervention was needed, and the United States, supported by the Security Council authorization of an international peacekeeping force in Mali. We have taken other steps to strengthen the security infrastructures in the region, including through bilateral agreement with Niger and the presence of UAV base in that country. But this should only be one step in our development of what I hope is a broader, more comprehensive approach to dealing with the instability and violent extremism in the region. To combat these and other armed groups and to reduce further threats to regional and international security, we must join with our partners in the Maghreb to enhance cooperation and prevent the spread of extremism and the flow of arms to the Sahel. We must create and implement a comprehensive and a multifaceted plan. We must consider what preemptory and preventative steps we can take to address the structural issues found across the region. Strengthening a country's essential institutions can help prevent any need for future military use. There are a number of regional challenges that are widespread and interlinked, from severe institutional underdevelopment, punishing socioeconomic conditions, high levels of poverty, and other troubling indicators that I'm sure will be the focus of today's testimony. The problems we are witnessing are long-term challenges to the region, and I'm concerned that they may only be setting the scene for additional crises in the future. There must be greater international attention placed on the Sahel. That's what we're doing today. I appreciate your holding this hearing, Mr. Chairman. I look forward to hearing from the witnesses.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deutsch. I now recognize the Chairman of the Terrorism, Nonproliferation, and Trade Committee, Ted Poe of Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Since 2012, coup in Mali, and the 2011 overthrow of Gaddafi in Libya, the security in the Sahel has gotten worse, not better. At a time when the United States, as it is said by the administration, pivots to the east, we cannot leave behind our obligation to the continent of Africa. Some might think that this is not a problem for the United States, but they're wrong. Most Americans, many Americans, shall I say, never heard of Mali until this crisis. They thought it was an island in the South Pacific. But what happens in the Sahel is directly related to our regional interests and security here at home. The prevention of attacks in our homeland and our Western allies by radical Islamic extremists is a challenge and will be for the foreseeable future. In the Sahel, Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, or AQIM, appears to be taking advantage of the chaos. That's what terrorist groups do. In January, thousands of French troops, along with local allied fighters, had to launch a military offensive because terrorists had taken over part of Mali, which is about the size of Texas. I want to commend the French for their efficiency and their quick response. Recently, the French announced that they will keep 1,000 troops in Mali for the foreseeable future to consolidate the gains and keep Al-Qaeda on its back foot. Recognizing the scope of this challenge, the United States has begun training African forces in neighboring Niger to fight in Mali. The United States only has about 1,800 troops in all of Africa, but 4,000 more are on the way to train African forces. Due north in Algeria, Al-Qaeda has brigades of radical killers aided by their brothers in Tunisia. And fortunately, the Algerian National Popular Army is doing its best to fight Al-Qaeda. The seriousness of the situation in Algeria hit home with us after the extremists attacked a gas plant on the border of Algeria and Libya. AQIM-linked terrorists wanted to seize the plant in the hopes of creating a massive explosion and killing everyone in the area. Fortunately, they were unsuccessful, but not before gunfights and a follow-up rescue mission resulted in the death of plant workers from 9 different countries. 3 of those killed were Americans, 2 of them being Texans, and 1 of them was my constituent, Victor Lovelady, from Atascocita, Texas. was an energy worker, and he was killed not just because of what he did, but because of who he was. He was killed because he was an American. Radical Islamic Al-Qaeda group by the name of the Signatories in Blood, what a lovely name that is, claimed responsibility for this terrorist attack. They're a spin-off of AQIM, and they seek to destroy us and kill us indiscriminately. This is the real world. This is not a fiction story. We've asked the Algerian government for Victor Lovelady's personal effects, but we haven't gotten them back yet. We've learned from the past couple of years that we are not good at predicting threats. Hope we can better understand today the nature of the terrorist threat in the Sahel and policy options available to us. And I look forward to the testimony of our witnesses.
Thank you, Chairman Poe. I now yield to the ranking member, Brad Sherman from California.
Thank you. Several groups have rebelled against the central Malian government for independence in northern Mali just in the last year and a half. The Tuareg tribes of northern Mali have had major socio-economic and political grievances against the Bamako government and have rebelled in the past. Gaddafi supported this movement and many Tuaregs have fought for Colonel Gaddafi as he struggled to stay in power. Before returning to Mali, Tuaregs took a large amount of sophisticated weapons with them, including a huge number of surface-to-air missiles looted from Libyan weapons depots. The Libyan weapons reinvigorated a long-standing rebellion and expanded it into a major conflict. We should learn from this lesson as we look at Syria. The outcome of in Syria is important to us. The outflow of weapons from Syria may turn out to be even more important. Returning to looking at Mali and the Sahel, we should note that the MNLA, the National Movement for the Liberation of Azawad, is fighting to create an independent country that would have less than 1 million people, as far as we can tell, and would include only half Tuaregs in the Sahel region. This seems to be an unrealistic objective from so many standpoints, including the world's general consensus that the borders in Africa are inviolate and that messing around with those borders could only lead to huge numbers of conflicts. The MNLA was initially backed by Ansar Din, the extremist Islamic group. Then that group and smaller Islamic groups began imposing a harsh version of Sharia law in some areas. Many of these extremist Islamists are foreign jihadist fighters. By July of last year, the MNLA had a falling out with the Islamic groups over their vision for the future of northern Mali. Ansar Din and the other Islamic groups seem to have the upper hand, and then France intervened, as we all know, in July of 2013 to beat back the advance on Mali's central government. And France has deployed thousands of troops with the aid of the United States, both in terms of aerial refueling missions, drones, other logistical support. Among the questions raised is the Malian government capable of defending itself and its territorial integrity, and for how long will it need French assistance to do that? We are still haunted by Colonel Gaddafi's legacy. We are facing the consequences of the arms leaving Libya. What can be done to both continue to contain weapons in Libya, which is still not a stable country, as recent events or relatively recent events in Benghazi illustrated? What can we do to make sure that we don't have more outflows of weapons from Libya? We need to examine the role of Saudi and Gulf states and well-connected, wealthy individuals operating with the tacit support of their governments in funding Islamic extremists in the Sahel and elsewhere. We need to ask what can be done to stop drug smuggling in the Sahel, and how big a problem is that, and who is earning the profits, and what are those profits funding. And we need to ask whether the Tuareg have legitimate concerns, and what can be done to meet those legitimate concerns without profiting the bad actors that have been operating in northern Mali. We have a lot to learn. We have some excellent witnesses, and I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sherman. We welcome back Ambassador Yamamoto, Donald Yamamoto, who is no stranger to the Africa Subcommittee, as well as the other committees that are here today, having testified several times before. He is Acting Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs, having served since 2009 as the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Bureau of African Affairs at the U.S. Department of State. His distinguished career has included serving as U.S. Ambassador to Ethiopia from November of 2006 to July of 2009, and as a Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the Bureau of African Affairs from 2003 to 2006. Without objection, his full resume will be made a part of the record. It is very distinguished. We'll then hear from Nancy Limborg, who has testified before our subcommittee as well as the other committees, especially on the Eastern African famine. She is the Assistant Administrator for the Bureau for Democracy, Conflict, and Humanitarian Assistance at USAID. She has recently spent 14 years as President of Mercy Corps, where she focused on international relief and development. During her time with Mercy Corps, she also served in a number of positions where she worked on issues related to foreign relations and foreign assistance. And again, like Ambassador Yamamoto, has a very distinguished resume, background, and without objection, that's a part of the record as well. Ambassador Yamamoto.
Thank you very much for your graciousness. And I submit a longer version for the record.
Without objection, it will be made a part of the record.
Thank you, Chairman Smith, Ros-Lehtinen, and Pope, and ranking members Bass, Deutsch, Sherman, and the other members of this committee for the opportunity to testify to you today. The countries of the Sahel face a complex series of interconnected and ever-evolving challenges. The 80 million people of the Sahel, representing roughly 10% of the sub-Saharan Africa's total population, live in some of the world's poorest countries, which consistently rank at the bottom of any human development scale. The security vacuum following the Libyan revolution and the crisis in Mali exacerbated the Sahel's long-standing political, economic, security, and humanitarian vulnerabilities. Instability in Mali and increased armed flows from Libya into the region also collided with a humanitarian crisis brought on by drought, poor harvests in the region, already burdened by chronic poverty and food insecurity. Addressing the Sahel's many challenging demands a comprehensive approach. We are working closely with regional countries and organizations to improve their capacity to secure porous borders and challenge terrorist and transnational criminal networks. The Trans-Sahel Counterterrorism Partnership, TSCTP, is the United States' primary vehicle to assist countries in the region to improve the counterterrorism capability and capacity to control border areas. Niger, Burkina Faso, Mauritania, and Chad are currently using training and equipment provided under TSCTP to contain the threat of AQIM and other extremist groups. Sahel countries have played an active role in supporting the French and African-led military intervention that has pushed extremists back into the isolated areas in northern Mali. Chad's role in Mali has been significant. Burkina Faso and Niger have also each contributed around 670 soldiers to the African-led International Support Mission in Mali, AFISMA. The United States is in the process of providing up to $96 million to support AFISMA troop and police contributing countries, including Niger and Burkina Faso. Improving security in the Sahel, however, requires more than counterterrorism responses. The acute security and humanitarian challenges facing the Sahel today demands a robust international response. Our short-term successes may be fleeting if we fail to address the long-standing political and economic fragility and render the Sahel susceptible to crisis and conflict. Poor governance, weak democratic institutions, and lack of development and economic opportunities cultivate fertile ground for instability. Improving governance, strengthening democratic institutions, and increasing economic opportunities, particularly for the young, and therefore central to improving Sahel's prospects for long-term stability and security. This is reflected in the UN Security Council Resolution 2100, which articulates a comprehensive approach to addressing the multifaceted problems facing Mali. And this is also intended to a conference that my colleague and I attended in Brussels to address this issue. While Mali and the Sahel remain extremely vulnerable, there are signs of progress. Niger, for instance, has achieved remarkable political and economic reforms since returning to democracy after the 2010 coup. Mali is also moving forward. The United States co-sponsored Resolution 2100 and joins the international community in supporting Mali's plan to hold presidential elections in July. The creation of a Malian Peace and Reconciliation Commission signifies another important step forward. Elections and national reconciliations are crucial in setting Mali back on the path towards peace and security. And so with this, I welcome your questions.
Ambassador Yamamoto, thank you very much. Ms. Limborg.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you, Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Bass, and members of the three subcommittee leadership, Ros-Lehtinen, Poe, Deutsch, and Sherman. Thank you for assembling us today for this important topic. As Acting Assistant Secretary Yamamoto noted, he and I were at a conference in Brussels last week where 80 nations came together to support Mali, which is an important development. During that event, President Traoré of Mali noted how grateful he was for the international support and the fact that terror had abated. And he commended us to address the root causes of this crisis with good governance as the first priority. And his comments, as many of yours did, really address the complex challenges that face the Sahel, where we have insecurity, weak governance, chronic underdevelopment that combine to result in great vulnerabilities to drought, to conflict, to terrorism. And these vulnerabilities have kept millions in the Sahel in a state of poverty and perpetual humanitarian crisis. I've visited 4 countries in the Sahel since the fall of 2011. Without question, there are bright spots. In Senegal, with a peaceful transfer of power in their last elections, women attained 43% of the parliamentary seats. A civilian, energetic government in Niger that has withstood the recent pressures. Remarkable farmer-led regreening efforts in Niger and Burkina Faso. However, the challenges in this highly complicated region have humanitarian and security implications that, as you've noticed, we absolutely must stay focused on. So 4 ways that AID is tackling these challenges. First, continued humanitarian assistance, life-saving for a region that is buffeted by continual shock. 2012 was the 3rd drought to hit the Sahel in less than a decade. It affected 18.7 million people, 8 million people in need of emergency food assistance. Thanks to the early warning systems that we've invested in for the past several decades, we saw signs of this drought as early as the fall of 2011. We were able to move in pre-positioned assistance and, I believe, forestall a much worse crisis. However, as that drought was coming forward, the conflict worsened in northern Mali. Malians fled to the south and across borders to communities that were already stretched by drought. In 2012 and 13, we've provided over $550 million in humanitarian assistance to the drought-affected and conflict-affected families. And this brings me to our second area of focus, which is building resilience. Even in the best of times, the Sahel has high malnutrition, and shock after shock keeps millions in perpetual crisis. We know that these will continue to happen, and what used to be 10-year cycles of drought are now every other year. Galvanized by the Horn drought, followed by the Sahel drought, we have launched a resilience agenda with the goal of reducing chronic crisis because of chronic poverty. We're working with international development partners to get ahead of the crisis and enable families and communities to weather these shocks more effectively. We've increased our team in the Sahel, and we have our development and humanitarian teams working together to design joint programs. Our third area of focus is governance. This is fundamental to stability, to sustaining our resilience and our development gains, and to withstanding the inevitable shocks. The March 2012 coup in Mali vividly illustrates this. Going forward, legitimacy will be essential for the sustainability of any democratic transition. We're working in Mali to support this return to democracy, as we are working to support and consolidate democracies in Niger and Nigeria and elsewhere in the region. Assistant Secretary Yamamoto has spoken about our efforts to counter violent extremism, and we continue to work as part of the interagency on the interagency Trans-Sahara Counterterrorism Partnership to complement our relief, resilience, and development efforts. None of these shocks will be defeated overnight, and the heart of progress will be legitimate, accountable, democratic governance. This is vital to ensuring that we have an alternative to extremism and to protecting precious development gains in the face of inevitable shocks for our own national and economic security and for the people of the Sahel who have already endured so much. Thank you very much.
Ms. Limborg, thank you very much for your testimony, and without objection, your full statement will also be made a part of the record. We do have 3 votes on the floor. I thought I would ask some questions, and then we go into a brief recess. Then we'll come right back and go to the other members for their questions, if that's okay. Let me just ask first, earlier today, as I mentioned earlier, I had a very good meeting with Mali Speaker Touré, who's obviously the former Prime Minister as well. And we spoke about a number of issues, including, the challenges of the July election. And I wonder if you might just speak to whether or not it can occur in a way that would be free, fair, and inclusive. We also talked about malaria. I chaired a hearing just a few days ago with Admiral Ziemer. We had Mark Dybel, who now is the Executive Director of the Global Fund, who told us that we are at a tipping point with bed nets now. There's a dearth, there's a lack of bed nets, despite the best efforts of the international community, including the United States, and that they are not forever. Once they last 2 to 3 years, they have to be replaced. And when there's a crisis like we've seen in Mali, infectious diseases and parasites are also opportunistic and could gain a foothold. And I wonder, Ms. Limborg especially, if you could speak, you spoke eloquently to the hunger issue, maybe elaborate a bit on what the issues are, the challenges on malaria and other infectious diseases. We also had a hearing just a few days before that with Dr. Frieden, who talked about multi-drug resistance and resistance in general. You talked about the resiliency efforts. Well, resistance is something we're all concerned about when antibiotics fail to do their magic. So if you could speak to those issues, I'd appreciate it.
Sure. First of all, for the July elections, we're working very closely with international partners and certainly with the Malians to do 2 things. First is support a reconciliation approach. One of the issues is addressing the fact that so many Malians felt disenfranchised and not a part of the overall conversation. We are supporting both that national reconciliation approach as well as support for the mechanics of the election. Clearly, one of the important issues is ensuring that the many refugees and internally displaced people have an opportunity to vote. And UNDP, along with UNHCR, are very much focused on ensuring that there are those kinds of more inclusive registration approaches. There are 2 parts to the election. One is the presidential, which is scheduled for July 28th, and it is unclear whether the legislative elections will be able to be held then or scheduled for later in the fall. It is critical that Mali have the elections as a means of returning to its democratic roots and taking a pathway forward. On your second question about malaria, this is critical. You're absolutely right in that even as we look at very high malnutrition rates, at the height of the drought, the largest killer of children under 5 in Burkina Faso was malaria. For that reason, as part of the resilience agenda, and it's a little bit like your three committees coming together, we have brought together across sectors, our teams in AID, to put together a more comprehensive, focused approach that includes our efforts to combat malaria and our family planning approaches and our food insecurity approaches together so that we're able to address some of the root causes across the sectors and have a more potent and effective approach to, even as we save lives, setting the pathway to development. Infectious diseases are always of concern when you're moving into emergency, and a lot of our efforts, in addition to our health programming, is also in water sanitation. And the final piece is that in addition to bed nets, it's the behavioral change that's so important, which is why you want to package these together.
Was the Brussels conference a success?
It was.
Please, that's fine.
It was very successful in that it both raised a lot of money, it kept the attention at the top of international, the issue at the top of international attention, and there was a combined agreement among most of the nations there that it was imperative for Mali to return to its democratic roots and to have national reconciliation as key to moving forward.
Almost out of time, but just if you could spend a moment on the State Department-led Pan-Sahel initiative charged with detecting and responding to suspicious movement. Has it worked? Are we happy with the coordination? And the other point, just like with these committees coming across lines, I know that the department is looking because there is a split in terms of jurisdiction. Is the coordination much improved, in your opinion? And what might we expect in terms of new initiatives?
Yes, as far as the coordination between not only the interagencies, but also with the governments involved in the Sahel has been very, I think, very cooperative and focused on really clear common agendas and themes. And then one last step going back to the elections in Mali. I think the elections in Mali will be critical to establishing and moving forward on a whole wide range of issues, because by going into the democracy issues, we can address the other issues. In other words, release our funding and assistance, which has been held up by the sanctions of 7008. But more important is that it's part of the linchpin of the other crises that we must address, which is the humanitarian crisis, the reconciliation in the north, and also the conflict with the extremists.
Ms. Bass.
Yes, I know we're getting ready to break to go to votes, but I just wanted to begin my questioning, and I can finish it when we come back. I wanted to know if you could briefly discuss the role that AFRICOM may be playing to secure the areas, and if you don't have time to finish, we can finish when I get back.
We're coordinating. I defer to our DoD colleagues on AFRICOM, but just shortly, in the Mali context, what AFRICOM and DoD is doing is not only the refueling for French aircrafts, but also intelligence sharing, which we're doing along a multi-agency. And the other issue is providing strategic lift within the region to help some of the 15 African countries who are participating in FISMA go into Mali to provide security assistance.
The subcommittees stand in brief recess, subject to the call of the chair. I do apologize to our witnesses for the delay. The subcommittees will continue their hearing, and I yield to Ms. Bass.
Thank you very much, and sorry you had to wait, but we are through with votes now. We won't be interrupted again. I know as I was running back and forth to my other hearing that you mentioned the conference in Brussels, and I wanted to know if you could describe the character of the conference and what new information may assist our committees. And then I know it was reported that over $4 billion was pledged at the conference. I wanted to know how much was the U.S.'s contribution and what stipulations were made to ensure that Mali takes appropriate steps to hold elections.
Hi, thank you. You know, it was very important that 80 nations came together at that moment to signal support for Mali. The funding that was raised is not all new money, I think, as the French noted. It includes money that is already in play. It also includes money that will be forthcoming from a variety of countries based on benchmarks achieved by Mali. But what is essential is that it provide that immediate assistance right now, especially as Mali moves forward to address national reconciliation and elections. We announced $32 million of new money that is primarily for humanitarian assistance and for specifically the refugees. But we also noted the funds that we've already put towards Mali, which includes the $550 million of humanitarian assistance regionally, and of that, $7 million of democracy, rights, and governance support specifically for Mali, and our funding for health programs and specific to Mali humanitarian. So I think that it was a very positive conference. We commended the French and the Europeans for hosting it, and we look forward to working with the international community on what is a very important and it won't be easy road to bring Mali back to democracy.
Well, you know, I wondered when we were there in February and met with the president, and we asked him how he was going to be able to hold elections with a couple 100,000 people displaced. And maybe you could respond to that, whether, you know, the capacity to do that, how it will be done, who will be monitoring.
Thank you. Let me just start for a couple points and turn to my colleague. The issue is that registration in the North. As you know, in the last election, there was about 37% of the people voted in 2007. And for credible elections to take place, you really need to have the registration of the minority groups, ethnic groups up in the north, the Tuaregs, the Songhais, and the Arab groups. Nancy Limborg and I talked to President Issoufou of Niger, and we said that we would like to work forward in registering the refugees. There's about 400,000 who are internally displaced or in refugee camps in the neighborhood. And so registering them, we figured that we can probably get to that those magical numbers and to make it a reasonably credible election. The French are also working in Kidal, so therefore you can have registration of groups in that area. It's not cleanest, it's messy, but at least we need to work forward. The elections are critical. The elections will be critical in holding, because from there we can do the other things that we need to do.
And you referred to the internally displaced.
That's right.
The externally displaced?
Right, in Niger, Mauritania, Chad, to register them as well in the refugee camps.
Right.
You want to add?
I would just simply add that USAID, with our efforts to provide election support, is very focused on ways to include the internally displaced populations. There are a number of measures underway, including outreach, information campaigns. There will be a need, as you probably heard when you were there, to continue to augment the capacities of the Elections Commission. There is a proposal to introduce biometric identification. And all of these measures we strongly believe must be accompanied by a reconciliation campaign, that there is that opportunity for dialogue so that people trust the elections and enable them to feel compelled to. So there's both the mechanics of it and then the communications campaign and ways to make it a more inclusive, legitimate process.
And could you speak some about USAID's humanitarian efforts in the Greater Sahel?
Sure. As I noted in my comments, we started in 2011 in the fall with efforts to provide humanitarian assistance to the drought, and doing so in a way that laid the foundation for greater resilience from even as we saved lives, overlaid by all this displacement. So we have both the ongoing efforts to address the drought, and one thing we kept in mind is that in the north, there was only ever 10% of the population that was in need, and in Mali, the greater need always was in the south with the food insecurity, just in terms of proportion. So the resilience agenda is giving us a way to address that, even as we look at ensuring we reach those populations in the north that are coming out of really a reign of terror over the last year.
Gentleman from Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess this question is for Ms. Lindborg. Am I saying that right? Are we able to identify a lot of the countries in the Sahel that are going to be U.S. friendly, for example, and if they're coming out of a background of terror, for example, how do we identify them and get the word out that we want to help them become stable economies, stable governments? Are we able to identify a list and then prioritize that list so that we can begin to work in the ones that need the most priority first? Firstest, is that a word?
Well, let me start, and I may ask my colleague if he wants to jump in on that.
Okay.
But, our humanitarian assistance is provided on the basis of need. And we work directly with communities in need, not through the governments. Our development assistance is very much about working in ways that create more accountable, more transparent, and more inclusive democracies, even as we invest also in health and agricultural programs. In the Sahel, there's a range of governments, and there are a range of ways in which we're providing support to strengthen both their democracies, but also investments in their economic and social indicators.
Without going through the list and counting the countries, is it 7, 10, 12?
We have development programs and development missions primarily in Senegal, and of that spine of countries, we did in Mali, and as Assistant Secretary Yamamoto said, the development activities are suspended until the return to the democratic roots of Mali. We are increasing our programming in Burkina Faso, in Niger. And in Chad, we have primarily just humanitarian assistance, as is the case in Mauritania.
Is there another country that you would identify that's probably going to need our help next? In other words, developing events where you could say on a timeline basis, we're going to be here next.
One of the problems with the Sahel is that it's chronically underdeveloped, and you could argue that it could absorb significant new development investments across the whole region. That's one of the reasons that we have partnered very closely with the European Union in an organization called AGIR, the Alliance for Global Investments in Resilience, because we know that we need to partner to leverage the investments that everybody brings to the table, both to build resilience and improve more inclusive governance at all levels, local level, national and regional.
Okay, and did you want to weigh in, Mr. Yamamoto?
I guess just a general comment is that not only coordinating with the other organizations, because this is not only a U.S. issue alone, it involves the regional states, but also the diaspora. You were mentioning how many countries are like the United States. You know, we did a survey about 70% of Africans like the United States, and why is that? Because we don't have the colonial baggage, but more important is you have a large diaspora.
You said 70%?
70%.
Okay.
You have a large diaspora in the United States who provide assistance and support, and that's also another group that we can rely on to help, engage and try to resolve problems in Africa.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield it back.
Thank you very much. Mr. Khan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Yamamoto, I'd like to ask a couple questions about Mali and its implications. I'm new to Congress, but when I saw the news in 2012 that the Mali government was struggling, that it might fall, that France in the end had to intervene, I found that to be somewhat surprising. I thought Mali was one of the more stable examples of a Sahel country. So I'd like to know, one, do you share that assessment first? Second, if so, what do you think we got wrong in our assessment? What did we miss in thinking that it was one of the better examples of stability in the region? And third, how does that assessment bear on what other countries might face similar instability?
Let me take a first crack and then turn to my colleague. I think the issue is that you look at these democratic countries or democratic-leaning countries, the issue is fragility of institutions within these countries. Mali is a very democratic country, but its institutions were very fragile. And so when you say, where did we fail, I think the issue is not so much, the failure. I think what you look at is there are a lot of number of issues. In other words, you had the influx of extremists coming into the area. You have the rise of the Tuareg rebellion. You have miscues and misplays by the government and making a military operation in the north rather than dialogue as some of their main input into trying to reach out to these ethnic groups. And so there's a combination of problems within these countries. What we're trying to do right now is A, to stabilize it, to return democratic values and good governance, to make the governments accountable to the people. And second is to address the terrible humanitarian crisis of 400,000 displaced. The other issue is to promote a dialogue with all the government, with all the ethnic groups and tribal groups. And the final point is to address the issue of extremism. So that's kind of thing, but you want to...
I would just underscore that anytime you have marginalized populations, even if you have successful democratic elections, if you do not address those grievances, you are setting the stage for longer-term problems and the possibility of the kind of conflict that broke out. And we see this in country after country, and it speaks to the importance of having an inclusive and very legitimate democracy, not just elections.
I believe that other countries in the region are expected to contribute peacekeeping forces for Mali. I know that Mali right now is the center of counter-terrorist operations in the region. Is there concern on your part that the peacekeeping forces from those other countries could weaken their defenses and encourage Islamic jihadists to move out of Mali and into neighboring countries?
That's a very good point. The issue is that right now, is we were speaking with the commander for the AFISMA, the African troops, and he made a very insightful comment. He said, we have 15 countries which speak 3 different foreign languages, and the capacity and capability is very different from each troop. But because these countries are committed to stability in Mali, because it's not only for Mali, but for the stability of the region. So are these countries also facing problems? Of course they are. Not only from extremist operations, but also internally from weak institutions, fragility. And so by them coordinating and developing and providing assistance in troops to the Mali operation, that speaks volumes of their commitment, not only to Mali, but also to their own defense as well. I think it's going to take time. It's going to take a lot of effort, but what we wanted to emphasize that this has to really be an African-led, African-managed operation, because ultimately they bear their full responsibility for what happens in that area.
And when France intervened, I know they took the lead, but the United States very promptly had to provide assets like strategic airlift, refueling, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance. I'm aware of those things as an ex-soldier. Are there other kinds of critical assistance that the United States government provided to either the French or to the Mali government that we should have in mind as we look at the possibility of having to intervene to support counter-terrorist operations elsewhere in the region?
You know, I defer to my DoD colleagues, but on the French side, of course, it's we did the presidential drawdown authority. So in other words, we had the about $19 million total for fuel for their aircrafts, and then intelligence that we collected. And the other thing is to provide lift for their equipment into the area, but also helping for lift of some of the African troops into Mali. As far as doing military operations or other things for the Malian government, you know, we have to go to the DoD side, but what we're trying to do is make sure that AFISMA and the troops there have the equipment they need and the support and logistical support, and also we're going to continue to contribute so they can develop a command and control center, coordinate and integrate all these troops and have good interoperability. I think those are going to be critical.
Thank you.
Scott, and thank you very much. And I would just want to observe that Speaker Touré is still here, the Speaker of the Mali Parliament, former Prime Minister. And I would just say, Mr. Speaker, you know, Tom Cotton, who just asked questions, one of the greatest things about our committee and really our Congress is the diversity of backgrounds. Tom spent 5 years on active duty. He's a graduate of Harvard Law School. So he combines that discipline, and he was deployed twice to Afghanistan and to Iraq. So when he asks questions that are relative to military issues, as do other members, all of whom come here with a great deal of background. So, Tom, thank you.
And I did join the Army after having gone to law school and practiced law, which may reflect on the depth of my legal skill and knowledge.
That's great. Thank you, Tom. Mr. Cook.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I have to apologize for my voice. I have a little bit of laryngitis. I haven't been giving a lot of speeches, obviously. But I just want to go back to your comment about the popularity of Americans, which I think obviously was a shock to a lot of people here. And I appreciate you explained why and how we could take advantage of that. And I think you already answered the question in terms of, you know, support those activities. And just the geography of the region there, there's so many different countries and the different religions and, excuse me, the different languages and ethnic groups, and how some type of, whether it's a European Union or some type of loose confederation or federation of African states, what is the glue, the common denominator? Because I agree with you. I think that's the only way. You know, Africa governed and the changes made by Africans. Outside interlopers are not going to do it. But I think we have the opportunity to help something like that. And I think what I'm looking for is some kind of common denominator to enable something like that. But when it's just very hard for me when I look at a map and you look at the different countries, and if just remember, you know, some of the countries, Ouagadougou, where they're the capitals, and was it Nouakchott that's the capital of Mauritania, and very, very difficult. Most Americans don't understand it, and particularly looking at a map, and I wonder if you might have any, if you could elaborate on the common denominators that you think are necessary for the Americans to have an impact in that area?
I think each and every day the United States has a tremendous impact. I mean, not only from the agencies, but from American industry. I mean, here today we have NGO groups, faith-based groups doing a lot of work in Africa and doing good work. I think one of the things that you raise is a very important issue is how do you bring all these countries together? The African Union is one form. You know, we've assigned an American ambassador to the African Union several years ago. Other countries have followed suit. We're trying to build capacity and capability. And then we're looking at the sub-regional groups, such as ECOWAS in the West, SEAC in the Central, SADC in the South, EGAT, all these different organizations and regional groups. And I think to build capacity, to build their ability to coordinate and to face challenges on their own, that really is kind of the goals and objective we're trying to do. And I think the careful coordination between these organizations and the goodwill that we have with these groups, I think we are looking at, I think, successes now, and they can multiply in the future. And so I think the amount of American foreign assistance, but mainly American goodwill. Look what the United States does today. We brought in justices recently to look at the American system. That really helped influence how they view how justice and law and their ability to talk with you, sir, and the chairman on how the parliaments and the Congresses should work and operate. That also helps to promote good governance. But I'll turn to my colleague for AID.
You know, when I was in Senegal, shortly after their parliamentary elections, I met with a group of women who were ecstatic because 43% of the new parliamentarians were women. And I was congratulating them, and one woman looked at me and she said, you know, this didn't happen overnight. We've been working on this for 25 years, and it's been with extraordinary help from the American public. And I say that to illustrate two things. One, that progress is possible, and two, that it's going to take a while. But it is about helping countries, communities, civil society, private sector feel an ownership stake in the future of their country and supporting their pathway forward. And we're seeing, as I noted, bright spots. Niger has an extraordinary program called the Nigerians Nourishing Niger. That is a very energetic, comprehensive look at how to create greater economic opportunities for their people. And it's when people feel included in that future and understand the support that the United States is providing for that, that you work on both those fronts. And the U.S. has been a tremendous partner for support for Africa that I think is borne out by these public opinion polls.
Two very brief questions. One, when it comes to inclusion and partners, are we including the faith-based groups, and to what extent? If you could orally say a word or two and then provide for the committee a breakout, if you will, a spreadsheet. And secondly, when 300,000 IDPs and, of course, 150,000 plus refugees, I know we're working hand in glove with the UNHCR and other friends, but what is the unmet need when it comes to those IDPs and refugees? Is there a dollar amount that could be affixed to what that need is, and maybe a breakout as to what the commodities are and other kinds of items that are now missing?
Well, first of all, we have wonderful faith-based partners throughout the region, and the importance of those groups is that they have been there through thick and thin, working at the community level. And we are honored to have them as partners, and would be delighted to provide you a breakout of who's doing what where. It's an impressive list. And we are, through that, able to leverage the generosity of the American public, which provides private support through these groups as well, so that we are able to greatly increase the overall assistance that we provide. It's part of the American generosity. On the needs of the IDPs and the refugees, there is a new UN appeal for 2013 of $410 million. And I'm delighted to provide the committee a breakout of what that goes to, what has come in, both from the U.S. and from other donors to date.
And again, what is our contribution to that 410 appeal?
Our contribution to date, just for Mali, refugees and IDPs, is $181 million, just over. And so there are both ongoing needs for just essential
So is that the same thing, the 410 appeal is also the Mali, or is
Correct.
that different? Is
That's
it-
just Mali.
That's just Mali.
That's just Mali. And so it's both ongoing needs.
Okay.
It's also, we've been very focused on ensuring that the impact on drought-affected communities is addressed as well, because many of them have gone to stay with communities that are already deeply stressed from the drought.
Now, in terms of the assistance, I was part of a launch with 7 African First Ladies 2 years ago. You might recall it very well. The first 1,000 days from conception to the second birthday. How well are we doing in the Sahel region with regards to backing up that unbelievably important first 1,000 days of life? Because if you get that right, of course, you're more apt to get the rest of it.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. That's critical, and we've increased our focus on nutrition during those first 1,000 days. And one of the most important things we've done from the emergency side is increased the development of the highly digestible therapeutic foods that are so critical for those first 1,000 days,
Right.
and refocus some of our assistance programs to work both on the behavioral changes as well as the more nutritional products that can address malnutrition, without which you have impacts for the rest of an individual's life.
Can I ask you, in terms of probiotics, has USAID integrated a probiotic mindset? Obviously, antibiotics have greatly decreased the ability of people in their gut to carry the good flora. Where are we in terms of promoting good probiotic efforts? The good organisms.
Yeah, there's some interesting new studies out that show that clean water can be even more important than antibiotic treatments for addressing some of the gastrointestinal diseases that affect children and create malnutrition. So part of that is investment in greater health, clean water and sanitation approaches.
Well, my point is, maybe you could take it back and get back, is, the whole idea of immunity, and there's a growing body of knowledge that immunity is almost exponentially enhanced by having the right probiotic mix in a person's gut flora. So I just, if you could get back to us,
We can give you more details on that.
Thank you for your testimony. I think we're finished with members, and thank you for your very honorable and effective service. Thank you. I'd like to now welcome our second panel to the witness table, beginning with Mr. Rudolph Atalia, a 21-year veteran of the U.S. Air Force who retired as a lieutenant colonel. He served in the Office of the Secretary of Defense as Africa Counterterrorism Director, where his responsibilities including advising the Secretary of Defense and other senior officials on counterterrorism policy and strategy, and serving as an advisor to the State Department and numerous embassies across Africa. He has been a featured guest on programs on APR, C-SPAN, and the National Geographic Channel, where he's discussed African counter-piracy and other successful resolution of the 2009 Marist, Alabama incident. We will then hear from Dr. Mimal Nudelakovic, who is a partner in the Schaefer Global Group, a Louisiana-based project development, finance, and implementation company focused on agro-industrial and renewable energy projects in the emerging markets in Africa and Latin America. For the Schaefer Group, he is the lead partner in a sugar project in Mali. He recently established an independent consulting practice on trade facilitation, project development, project finance, and public-private partnerships in Africa. And then we will hear from Ni Agwete, who is an independent policy researcher and analyst who specializes in U.S. foreign policy, African development, and international relations. He often publishes in American and African journals and appears on Al Jazeera, Voice of America, the BBC, and other TV and radio outlets analyzing African issues. He has been a Georgetown University professor, journal editor, and leader of advocacy organizations working on 3 continents. He created and led 2 organizations focusing on democracy and conflict in Mali. Colonel, if you could begin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, distinguished members of the subcommittee. I submitted a written statement for the record.
Without objection, yours and all of the others' full statements will be made a part of the record.
Since my testimony on the situation in Mali last June, things have escalated dramatically, causing further instability in the Sahara and the Sahel. Many skeptics underestimated the Islamist threat and claimed that the Saharan branch of AQIM was only focused on kidnappings for ransom and illicit trade rather than jihadist activities. A year later, Mali is faced with a new threat, suicide bombers, a phenomenon never seen in the Sahel before. In fact, since 9 February, Mali has experienced 12 suicide attacks in the cities of Timbuktu, Gao, Kidal, Menaka, and now Gossi, which happened on 9 May. These are primarily areas that were once under Islamist control after the secular MNLA was elbowed out by AQIM and its allies. I'm concerned that in time, AQIM's influence and tactics will grow more sophisticated and violent following a similar evolution seen by the Nigerian jihadist group Boko Haram from 2011 to present. The root causes of terrorist escalation in Mali and across the region are complex and multifaceted. Understanding the why of this present violence and the logic of its perpetrators requires us to look more closely at some of the principal regional issues that contributed to this current crisis. First, militants linked to al-Qaeda, hardened by years of survival under oppressive regimes, have been revived in this region since the start of the Arab Spring. Seasoned fighters from Afghanistan, Algeria, Iraq, Syria further bolster their skills and intent, helping them to expand their networks, strengthening their fighting capacities, and resolve to recruit new militants. Terrorist training camps exist in several parts of the region, and every state is vulnerable to AQIM, which has been massively bolstered by weapons flow, porous borders, and security vacuums in the Sahel in combination with fragile regional governments. The recruitment narrative of AQIM has also been given new life via Western intervention in Mali and renewed increasingly severe focus on Western targets. The recent attack in Amenas in Algeria, the hostage crisis, and the September 11, 2012 attack on the U.S. consulate are just exemplify some of these patterns. Another catalyst for violence, violent extremism in Mali and the broader region is the confluence of marginalized peoples pushed into harsh border areas and violent extremist organizations. Militant Islamists like AQIM, Boko Haram, Mujao, Ansar ad-Din, and others prove attractive to some within marginalized ethnic groups coerced into a veritable no man's land seeking social justice and political recognition. Despite the French intervention in 2013 of this year designed to root out AQIM, the former has most certainly not concluded its project in Mali. For the better part of a decade, proselytization, intermarriage, a variety of inducements, and alliances with tribes have left AQIM with many friends in northern Mali and the region. Moreover, AQIM fighters have opted for tactical withdrawal versus the supposed strategic defeat that some claim. Some militants clearly remain in the country, evident by the increased suicide bombings, while others have merely taken refuge in Libya, Algeria, Sudan, Niger, Mauritania, and elsewhere. In sum, the French, Chadian, and Malian efforts in the main push against AQIM and their allies out of Mali, the network remains resilient and has emerged less effective but more clandestine in nature. In contrast to Mali, Morocco stands out as a model for reform and progress in the region. It continues to fight terrorism through the strengthening of the security and justice systems and emphasizes a preventative dimension against violent extremism and organized crime through reform in the economic, political, social, religious, and educational fields. And they've actually put this all in Amazigh, or the Berber language. Nevertheless, like other countries in the region, Morocco is concerned with the risks of infiltration by terrorists fleeing Mali via illegal immigration channels. For example, 2 weeks ago, Moroccan authorities dismantled 2 terror cells that, according to news agencies, were believed to be in contact with jihadists in Mali. While there are few proverbial silver bullets to solve this complex problem set, there are several approaches that could make a difference, and let me provide a few of them. The first recommendation is, as we were discussing with the previous panel, to bring USAID back into the fight in the key territories in northern Mali and the surrounding region, couple that with the support of U.S. and allied special forces initiatives. From Tindouf, Algeria to the Awuzu Strip in northern Chad, the arc of instability as the UN calls it, the populations of this undergoverned region receive little support and are left exploited by various political actors, including AQIM and its allies. The second recommendation pertains to addressing border insecurity in the region. Borders between countries of the Sahara remain porous and open to terrorist and smuggler activity, both of which weaken governance and promote corruption, not to mention global insecurity. It's time that these countries of the region receive assistance to secure and monitor movement along their borders. This applies not only to land traffic, but also to air. Finally, to effectively counter the jihadist narrative wielded by AQIM, a comprehensive and expertly crafted information operations campaign is necessary for the region. Violent extremists associated with AQIM experience far too much safe haven in social, print, and televised media, and this must be rectified. Recently, news agencies flocked to write about AQIM's new Twitter account, which gained 5,000 new members in 2 weeks. And it's noteworthy that the Syrian terror group Jabhat al-Nusra, Somali al-Shabaab, Tunisia's Ansar al-Sharia are all followed by this new AQIM Twitter account. Countering AQIM's media expansion and online havens is crucial to our long-term success against violent extremism in the region. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your testimony and concrete recommendations for the committee and for the administration to consider. Mr. Nedeljkovic.
Thank you, Chairman Smith and honorable members of the Foreign Affairs Committee. I appreciate the opportunity to speak. I was asked to speak from a business perspective in dealing in Africa and especially in the Sahel. I like the formula. I'm new to this, but there is a full statement, so I can just speak off the cuff. What I have been in Africa pretty much all my life. You can tell from the accent, and thank you for attempting to pronounce Nedeljkovic. I come out of the Balkans, so we know a little bit about tribal warfare. Left Belgrade at 1-year-old, grew up in Ethiopia, actually my first 10 years before coming to the U.S. and making this a home. So I have spent most of my life one way or another in Africa. I've been on the public side, I've been on the private side. I had been going many moons ago when AID first discovered the private sector, brought in as an advisor to see how the private sector could assist. Was named to be the U.S. Executive Director of the African Development Bank in the late 80s under the first Father Bush administration. So I've since then have joined Schaefer. Schaefer is an agro-industry. We've been managing, developing agro-industrial projects throughout the continent. We've also been in very difficult places. We did the major sugar estate development in Kenana in Sudan. Got pulled out of there for various reasons, as you know, that happened, and that we got pulled out on U.S. sanctions. Most recently, and in the last decade, I would say, we've been working a major project in the Office du Niger in Mali. Our attempts are always at bringing in these small farmers into the investments, into the schemes that we develop. It is the only way we see in the end, and I like this term resilience. I have to remember that. I always thought of it as economic growth, but I guess it's one and the same, the flip side of the same coin. The importance in the end is very simple for me. I went back. I actually have a PhD in political risk, so I went back and thought what I wrote back in my dissertation. There was a sociologist, Maslow, and his theory of the 5 critical requirements, the pyramid of needs. And the very basic 2 needs at the bottom of the pyramid are your food, the water, the survival, and then shelter and employment. And if those needs are not met, you will have always the opportunity under whatever guise for extremism to come. You will find radical solutions. I would call them romantic solutions. But it's very easy. People that have nothing to lose have nothing to lose. And that is where we come from the business standpoint, Mr. Chairman. Looking at difficult areas, I would argue that U.S. business, and we're there in agro-industry, certainly, there's a huge Niger River coming through that area. There are many opportunities to develop agro-industrial schemes that bring in all of the small farmers. But for all of this to happen, you have to have security. We put together a program of over $600 million for the Office du Niger near Ségou in Markala that basically went on hold. We were to go into the major expansion on April 15th, and something happened in February, so we are on hold. Who loses? It's the people there in the end, because what have we done now? We've concentrated on projects elsewhere. I could use an example in Nigeria, where we're up in Sokoto in a rice program. Things got heated up, became very difficult to work. Well, we're not developing the program, the project down in the Middle Belt states. Who loses? The people in the north. So in the end, my plea is really the extent possible, and I think USAID has been moving in this direction with by various names, Global Development Alliance or other, to bring in the corporates, get people in that are in, especially people like us, are in agro-industrial area. We operate in rural areas. We operate where poverty is. And the only way you're going to get out of poverty is to create growth, to create jobs. And otherwise, you're going to have desperate people, and desperate people do desperate acts. So for me, Mr. Chairman, that is the one takeaway I really wanted to pull out of this discussion with further questions. I do want to also be remiss to not say I sit on the board of the Corporate Council in Africa. I'm one of the founding members. I'm on the Partnership to Cut Hunger and Poverty in Africa. So I can sit and have the debate either public policy side or from a straight corporate investment standpoint. But I will argue that it's always when those two come together, that is the key. That is where we can have the long-term development money come in with the commercial money to make growth happen. We have, and I have copies, submitted a couple of months ago recommendations to the Obama administration from the Corporate Council in Africa on doing business in Africa. And I would also like to conclude by saying the continent, by and large, the trend is very, very positive. The issue is what happens in difficult places like the Sahel, and how can public and private interests come together to actually really continue on the basis of resilience. But let's also get on. This is one world. We must also all grow, and people must have some reason to not be desperate. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Dr. Nedeljkovic, thank you so very much for that. And the recommendations in your, I have seen that. I'd like to at least take some of that and put it into the record, and we will follow up on those recommendations as well. I thank you for that. And remember, you're not just speaking to Congress, you're speaking to the Speaker of Mali. So I hope he heard your message as well. I'd like to now ask Mr. Akwete if he could proceed.
Chairman Smith, thank you very much for including me in this hearing this afternoon. And I thank you and the other subcommittees for placing so much attention on an important Africa issue. Point of personal privilege, because I'm an immigrant from Ghana, I'm an African, I'd like to extend to you the appreciation of fellow Africans for the attention that you and the committees are placing on this very important issue. I also have to say that, as was mentioned by Mr. Nedeljkovic, there is some good news in Africa. The OAU is celebrating its 50th anniversary. The president is visiting 3 countries noted for their advanced, progress in democracy. There's fast economic growth. So I think it is appropriate that this hearing is focusing on a troubled spot, a big area that is under stress. But it should be noted that there is good news on the continent. Now, the region that we are talking about, and in the invitation letter, about 9 countries are covered. So we are talking about a very big area. I would also even add that there's one area we should include, which is the Western Sahara, because some of our research shows that some of the problems in the Western Sahara is spilling over into Mali in terms of fighters with grievances who may be involved in Mali. Now, the problems that the Sahel, as defined in this hearing, is facing are very serious problems, from terrorism all the way to bad governance, to lack of democracy. So this is a region in stress. And always when I look at U.S. policy, it seems to me that there is a very big unspoken question by the American people. What has this got to do with me? What has this got to do with us? And I think it's great to focus on this problem because it does affect U.S. interests. The problems in the Sahel, which are stressing the countries, does affect the U.S. And therefore, it seems to me the imperative is very clear for the U.S. to help these countries cope with the problems that they are facing. Otherwise, when the problems get out of hand, they spill over into the neighborhood. It will not be just one or two African countries if the problems get out of hand. It will affect Europe clearly. It might even, because one of the problems that was has been cited, is drug trafficking from Latin America through West Africa. I think research has shown that there is a reverse. There is drug money going back into Latin America and even arms. So this can also affect U.S. interests in its own hemisphere. It can affect U.S. interests in Europe. So this is a very important issue, and any help that the U.S. gives African countries to cope with them is really, I think, a good investment in its own interest. Now, one of the things that strikes me is that I think in the area we are talking about, the U.S. interest really picked up after 9/11. It's been 10 years, so a key recommendation, a key point in my view is that there needs to be a review of U.S. strategy in the region after 10 years, and after the problem in Libya, now we have Mali. It seems to me that a thorough review needs to be done so that lessons can be learned and a new strategy can be crafted. Until that thorough review is done, it seems to me there are areas where improvements can be made. I think that terrorism is a problem, not just for the US, but even for African countries. And I think the way to deal with it is to push hard on democracy, because it seems to me inclusive democratic government goes a long way in preventing, at the very least, homegrown terrorism. In the region that we are looking at also, Mali is clearly the epicenter. So it seems to me that special attention should be paid to Mali, and I would like to see the US play a leading role, not in the security area, because we have a FISMA and the UN, but in the reconstruction of Mali, what just happened in Brussels. I would like for the US it's my recommendation that the US plays a very strong role in that, particularly in two areas. The area of the elections. I have to confess, Mr. Chairman, that I'm one of the people who are nervous about the elections, because the recent example in a couple of other African countries, Cote d'Ivoire next door and Kenya, that we need to make sure that as important as the Malian elections are, we have to have contingency plans and make sure that they happen well. And secondly, I think the Mali's reconstruction plan, the Reconciliation and Dialogue Committee, I think that the US, with its history and its diversity and its democracy, can be a special help to the US. So it's also my recommendation that that should be a big focus in a way that the US can help Mali and therefore the Sahel region going forward. I thank you again for including me.
Thank you very much for your testimony. Just let me ask you on that last point about the elections. Are you concerned about the July elections? Nothing focuses the mind like a deadline, and sometimes when deadlines are delayed, it leads to a certain ennui and a certain things can spiral out of control again. So there seems to be a positive in having it in July, but if you could elaborate on your concerns, and any of the other panelists, if they'd want to touch on that.
Yes, and I'm particularly grateful for that question too, because I do see the need for elections. I mean, there is a lot of good that elections can do Mali. Even the issue of the MNLA and Tuaregs, you need to know who represents whom. Who does the MNLA speak for? Who are other people who speak for other communities? And elections will help with that. You do the research and you will see that a lot of people say that they want a government in Bamako that the people themselves elected. So I'm saying, on the one hand, it is important and good to have elections. At the same time, because elections are so important, we need to make sure that they are done right. And that means a lot of preparation, from registering people, and the fact that you have so many displaced people in Mali causes me some nervousness. So thinking about it, I agree with you that there should be a deadline to make sure that we move quickly. But I also think we need what I will call electoral insurance policy. Given the difficulties that Mali has, it seems to me there should be contingency plans to say, what do we do if we run into this particular obstacle or that particular obstacle? So I think the elections should be done. They should be done as fast as possible, but we all should also be aware of the obstacles and the dangers that bad elections can lead to.
Dr. Nedeljkovic.
Chairman, I would agree that it's essential there be a deadline. I'll draw from an example next door in Guinea. We're involved in a rice program. There, the elections are now, we're halfway through the administration, 2.5 years later, we haven't had the legislature. So I think the most critical thing is you will not have the perfect elections, clearly. But one must get on with having as good an election as you can. Is July too soon? One could argue perhaps that it's important that it's perceived as legitimate and that people can, in fact, vote. But I certainly, if it were to be pushed back, would not push back very far, because what is happening is, in essence, all of us are on hold waiting for this to happen, and it's those very investments that will, in the end, stabilize the country and bring back the growth to make it go forward. So I would argue better an imperfect election sooner than the perfect one later. Thank you.
Mr. Atala.
Mr. Chairman, just for briefly, if I may comment, I agree with pushing for elections. However, there are some underlying issues in the country that have been festering now since the independence of Mali in 1960. And if we don't address local grievances and the divide between North and South, I think what we return to is a forced election and the continued problem sets that remain in the country. Those need to be addressed for fair elections going to the future. We have to address those internal dynamics, and those need to come right now before the elections in order to bring everybody together. Thank you.
Dr. Nedeljkovic, you mentioned in your written testimony that the old saying that capital is a coward and that it goes into flight, obviously, when there's a crisis. And yet you cite the example of China, India, and other nations who continue to invest in Africa. Why are American companies so reluctant? As you might know, I've introduced legislation, and it's co-sponsored by my friend and colleague, Ms. Bass, and we are building a co-sponsor, hopefully a large group, that would put a very heavy emphasis on exporting to Africa. Obviously, a rising tide raises all the boats. We know that AGOA is working, but it's only one initiative among what should be many. Why are we so reluctant?
Thank you for the question, since I've been living the last 20-plus years since leaving the ADB. You know, Mr. Chairman, the reluctance is one of, capital is a coward. It needs certainty, okay? That certainty can be bad, certainty can be good, but I need to know what that certainty is so I can mitigate. This was actually the irony, in some extent, that really Mali, even we that have been operating all over, Angola, Sudan, I mean, you name it, we're a bit surprised. If you dig back far, you would say, well, but in essence, as a colleague said, these were discrepancies from the north and the south in the country. Maybe why am I surprised that it boiled over? It's those uncertainties that are difficult for American companies. Now, at the same time, and I refer to the patchwork, if you look at 60, 70, 80% of the countries, most of the trend is very positive. I look at my own reactions here. At some point, I was about ready to hang up the boots. You know, I've been doing this for many years. And then I said, you know what, this is crazy. When the continent finally, for 30 years, 20 years, I've been scratching odd and ends sort of deals. Now real deals are happening. There are real business deals happening, Mr. Chairman. And it's not just oil and gas. It's that growing middle class. There's a consuming, substantive group. When you start speaking of Nigeria, you start speaking of Nairobi in Kenya, you start speaking of Tanzania. There's so many centers now of growth where investment is interesting. What I hope the lesson that will go back to both the political and social, society in the unstable areas is, you know what, ladies and gentlemen, if you want that capital needs to have some stability. Otherwise, it will very happily go elsewhere. So help us come, because then we all win. That, I think, is the message needs to come on. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me ask you, Mr. Akwete, you mentioned that there's a great burden and stress being placed on Mali's neighbors because of the refugees that are spilling over the border. Could you perhaps elaborate on what that burden is, and is there an expectation that those individuals will be able to be repatriated back to their homes?
I think, and in fact, thank you again. I think it's connected to my answer to the elections question, because of course, these people, one of their fundamental rights, the displaced people, both in southern part of Mali and in the other regions, is the right to vote. So if elections are being held, we have to think about how do we allow them to cast a vote. In terms of the stress placed on the other countries, I mean, and again, I'm very glad that this hearing is about the region, not just about Mali. The Mali's neighbors are also stressed. It just so happens that because of the Tuareg problem and the MNLA coming from Libya, Mali imploded. But the other countries are also at risk. And therefore, it's a question of countries that are already at risk that now have had to play host to the refugees from Mali. It seems to me it is clear that they are under stress in terms of food, in terms of water, in terms of the impact on very fragile agricultural communities. Now, I am glad that in the previous panel, the discussion, I think the one area where the U.S. has been doing a pretty good job is the humanitarian assistance, especially in the region. But I still think these are countries that really do need help, and it will be good to increase that. And if I might, on the question of U.S. companies and their presence in Africa, which is an issue that concerns me, I would just add that, Africans are also puzzled. I mean, I would echo your questions. We would like to see more involvement from the U.S. The elephant in the room is the presence of the Chinese. And I will actually say that, I mean, I have been in the U.S. for quite a while, going into my fourth decade. And what I don't understand, I think that the U.S. has far more positive assets if you look at the Chinese versus the U.S. There are people like me, African-born, but of course there is the African community, the African-American community here, which is a big asset. So frankly, it puzzles me that with all those assets, with the U.S.'s democracy, as Ambassador Yamamoto said, the U.S. is very popular in Africa. So if you look at that, if you look at the experience with capitalism, if you look at the black community in this country, it seems to me the U.S. should have a much bigger presence. And I too, like you, I don't understand why U.S. companies haven't made bigger progress into the continent.
On that point, our legislation would try to encourage the diaspora as part of a strategy to be more involved with reconnecting and certainly being part of an export strategy. So thank you for your comment. Just two final questions, and I'll yield to my friend and colleague, Ms. Bass. Mr. Akwete, you mentioned that in your testimony that the government of Niger has handled the potential Tuareg threat much more effectively than the government of Mali. Could you explain what they're doing differently and why it has worked better?
Thank you again. A lot of this is from the analysis of experts on the area. What I do know for a fact, for instance, is that in the immediate aftermath of the Libyan problem, and when people moved south into the countries bordering the south of Libya, one of the things that the Nigerian government did was they said, they insisted that everybody coming from Libya who wanted to go into Niger had to disarm, and if they refuse to disarm, they cannot get in. Now, on the other hand, it's not clear how Mali handled that, but all the experts and in fact, Nigerian officials say, this is what we did. We said nobody can come in who had arms, otherwise we are not letting them in. It's not clear how that was handled in Mali, but we do know that the MNLA, which was heavily armed, and I have seen statistics that say that some say there were 800 of them, others like 2,000 of them. One way or another, they happened to enter back into Mali, and the war, the rebellion started.
Mr. Atala, one final question. You testified that there was an underestimation of the jihadist intentions of al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb. Could you explain as to why that was the case, and are we repeating that mistake, in your opinion, anywhere else in the Sahel?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, I think the issue has been festering for a very long time. In fact, for two decades. Specifically, if I look at northern Mali, GSPC, which is a precursor to AQIM, established itself in late 2002, early 2003. In fact, I was in the northern parts of Mali at the time. I was still in uniform, running around looking at the problem set. Since then, they've intermarried within ethnic groups in the north. They've done the same thing across the region. And this is where AQIM becomes a threat. If you look across the region, and I'm going to include North Africa in it, currently Tunisia, the fledgling government in Tunisia, is fighting affiliates of AQIM in the western side of their border. Southern Libya has AQIM. AQIM has direct connections with Boko Haram, and the current government of Nigeria is involved in trying to push Boko Haram and Ansaru from the north, with a lot of refugees pouring across the border. We have AQIM operational in northern Niger, in Mauritania, and of course in Mali. So they're all across the region. The problem is, and what I find amongst peers, my colleagues, is we try to quantify AQIM saying, oh, they're about 3,000 strong or 2,000 strong or whatnot. That's irrelevant. They can be 10 or 15, it doesn't matter. The fact is that every single time the Shura Council, which exists in the northeastern part of Algeria, when one of their members speaks, they are able to incite and bring and leverage people into the fold. And this is where we have the issue. Today, there are over 800 Tunisians fighting on the militant side in Syria. Sooner or later, these guys are going to come back. Many of them have connections to AQIM. So the problem set is not only within the African context, but outside of that as well. And this is where we are literally missing the boat. I think we need to do more. And those are the three small recommendations I made. There are several others, but we need to get involved in this issue across that region of the Sahara.
Thank you so very much. Ms. Bass.
Yes, just following up on that, when you were talking about AQIM, and you might have referenced it when I was running back and forth to committee to vote, so excuse me if I'm asking stuff you already covered. But do you think that there's a degree of a coordination between the different factions, or is it similar to al-Qaeda where there's spin-offs, but they're not necessarily working in coordination?
Thank you very much for your question. As far as I understand so far, it depends on where, but there is definitely coordination. It depends also loosely on how we define coordination. For example, there's been a lot of testimony on what happened in Benghazi, but it's understood, at least from experts, that the Sahara branch of AQIM, one member specifically, Mukhtar Bal-Mukhtar, was getting feed of information what was going on in Benghazi. Currently, what's going on in Tunisia, there are members there that are specifically battling in Tunisian authorities that have direct links to the Shura Council or to the emir of AQIM, Drukdal. Same thing within Boko Haram. Boko Haram, for example, in Nigeria, has had connections to AQIM for a very long time. In fact, Abu Bakr Sheku, the emir of Boko Haram, had one of his messages pushed on AQIM media back in 2011. It was an audio tape. that AQIM kind of facilitated. So there are coordinations here and there, and that's part of the issue. We know so little about the Band of the Sahara-Sahel, and some of these groups are linked to AQIM not out of ideological, views, but sometimes out of just necessity of survival, because AQIM has become the wealthiest affiliate out of all the AQ affiliates around the world.
Wealthiest from drug trafficking?
From kidnap for ransom, and I would say a lot of Western countries are to blame for that. They, over the years, 2007, 8, 9, we see multiple kidnappings, and in return, payments that are provided in return for these. The last one was more recently, not even a year ago. You had aid workers that were kidnapped from the Tindouf area, and in return, 2 AQIM affiliates were released from a Mauritanian jail, and supposedly AQIM received 15 million euros. I was in contact with friends in northern Kidal. They said that for the longest time, folks were no longer using the West African CFA, but they were actually using euros to pay for things. That's indicative of how deep-rooted this problem set is.
So you're saying the Western countries are to blame because they're paying the ransom?
They're enabling.
What should they do?
Well, again, this is where, and that's a fair question. This is where I think we need to stop enabling, and we need to really focus on the problem sets. Messaging is important. The current recruits that AQIM is able to leverage, they've built this over time, but 12 suicide bombers, never seen in the history of Mali. We're not messaging in these problem set areas. We're not dealing with the root causes of the problem. And in fact, we just put, as I, it's pardon the expression, a Band-Aid on a sucking chest wound. It just doesn't work.
Thank you. Thank you. And I'm sorry, I'm not going to attempt. Would you describe a couple of your businesses, specifically what do you do and where are you working? And actually, let me ask you about Mali, because I'm just, I have a big interest, especially as Mr. Akwete said, in promoting U.S. businesses, and in particular, African-American businesses, their involvement on the continent. And so I'm wondering how you do work in Mali. What do you do?
Thank you, Congresswoman. We are in agro-industry. We're primarily in the process side. So being out of Louisiana, it's sugar cane processing, it's rice milling, and it's always a cogeneration of electricity from the agri-waste. So in the Mali project, in fact, I believe Eric had a chance to speak with the people out there when you were in Bamako. It was to be 200,000 tons of sugar produced, 30 megawatts of electricity, and 10 million liters of ethanol, actually, for a 10% gasohol blend on all the gasoline.
And it's in Bamako or around Bamako?
It's in Ségou and Markala, in the office du Niger. It is using the strength and the value of water. Agriculture is water. And this is why I say, oftentimes, while one looks at the Sahel, it's a very, very desperate region. From an agro-industrial standpoint, I say, well, quite the opposite. You have a major, major river that's coming through that needs to be properly harnessed in a sustainable way. The key is absolutely the way you structure it. And this comes back to the question of why U.S. investments don't go in. Investments that are small are just going to be difficult for international investors to come in. So the key becomes sizing the investment. For agro-industry, if you don't scale up, you can't compete. Now, that does not mean you dislocate the small farmers. What it does mean is literally capturing them in the scheme as outgrowers. In our case, in the 15,000 hectares, 7,000 were going to be independent small farmers that are being brought into modern agriculture, if you will. The same happens with our rice schemes now in Nigeria. The key is always bringing in the community, bringing in the small farmer, and guess what? In the end, that will be what is beyond the Band-Aid on wherever it is that you're placing it, because then it's those people that will make sure that this doesn't get undermined. Unfortunately, in Mali, we were about to start up. the major operation. Had we been there a year or two, I'm willing to bet that the region would act differently. Those would be the people protecting our interests going in there. So I would continue to argue for that combination of larger investment, which is an interesting for international groups, with schemes that bring in the smaller. And then there is one very important theme, coming back to what Congressman Smith was asking, that is, if you take out Nigeria, South Africa, Kenya, most of these economies are just simply too small to be interesting.
Right.
And I hate to say it, but the ECOWASs and the economic communities have all spoken very nicely, but in reality, those are not functioning as true common markets. And in our case, for example, on the sugar estate, and the Mali delegation ambassador knows very well, it is sized to the point where now we're taking advantage of being landlocked. The advantage is you've got a huge population that grow the national markets. We don't need to export the sugar to the U.S. It's not even interesting. The price is a lot more interesting for sugar and rice in the region, grow it. But what happens then is if those common markets are not functioning,
Right.
you begin to have to start subsidizing the small factories. That doesn't work. The reality of the world has to come back in, and that goes also on the policy side, on the African side.
Well, I really appreciate what you're saying. I mean, one of our challenges here in trying to work with businesses to go to the continent is they're afraid to death. Well, I mean, basically it's our own ignorance of the continent. So when we hear a conflict in Mali, we think that it's happening all over the place, and we have no geographic understanding as to where one country is, you know? So you've been able to do this in Mali, in the middle of a conflict. And I think that's a really important perspective to bring. Even when there is a conflict, you can still successfully do business, let alone all of the nations where there isn't a current conflict. So I appreciate that. And Mr. Akwete, I wanted to ask you about a few things that you were saying. You talked about the U.S. playing a stronger role. And I wanted to know what your opinion was, how U.S. security activities in the region are perceived by the governments and populations in the Sahel. So I always worry about the U.S. playing a stronger role, but how do we, you know, where is that fine line between playing that stronger role and then feeling as though we've overplayed our hand?
Thank you very much. I think it's a great question. And also, especially because you mentioned governments and people, sometimes I think that there is a split in how some particular U.S. programs may be looked at. But it seems to me that, as I mentioned, the U.S. interest in the Sahel, West Africa and North Africa really picked up for understandable reasons after 9/11. Mm-hmm. So the issue is terrorism and the potential for terrorism. And I think it is important to underline that terrorism is a problem for Africans as well. I mean, Boko Haram has been killing Nigerians. The embassy bombings killed a lot of Africans. So Africans welcome the U.S.'s help in dealing with terrorism. I do think that there should be dialogue about what particular approaches will work. I think if there's that dialogue, then we don't overstep and don't do things that may make Africans nervous. I particularly think that a stress on democracy will be a very good way, paradoxical as it may sound, will be a very good way of dealing with terrorism and potential terrorism across Africa. So yes, I want the U.S. to say, look, this is very important to us, we want to be engaged, but then have a dialogue with the Africans, whether regionally or in particular countries, as to exactly what will work. If I might mention one particular example, for instance, training African militaries. I think this is part of the strategy for dealing with terrorism in Africa. But in my mind, it has to be in 3 stages. I think the first thing that African soldiers need is respect for civilian authority, to know that an elected president is really their commander-in-chief and it is treason to turn a gun on him. I think the second phase for training for African soldiers has to be respect for citizens, that the citizens pay their salaries, pay for their uniforms, and it's not their job to abuse them. I think if they pass those two phases of tests, then for me, you go to the third level, which is how to make them better fighters. So I would say, again, the U.S. needs to be involved, dialogue with the Africans, and particularly on the training of the soldiers, make sure that they respect democracy and they respect civilian authority.
So taking Mali for an example, do you think that what we did didn't work? Or, I mean, because we trained the military there, and that's exactly what the military did. So is it that it didn't work, or, I mean, that's always the fine, you know, the fine line. How do you determine when you've moved from one stage to the other?
I think it's a great question. Here, without ducking the question, I need to be display some humility, which is why, in fact, an important point in my testimony, and even last year when I was here, is that I think the U.S. needs to do the most thorough of reviews of the strategy over the 10 years and look at everything. Experts will have to do it. I think Congress will have a role, experts in DOD will have a role, so they can determine exactly what the training went to and what it was meant to achieve, where things may have gone wrong, and what lessons can be learned from it. So in terms of, if you look at just the results, of course, I think it is disastrous for Mali that there was the coup and the role of a U.S.-trained soldier in that coup.
Right.
It doesn't make the U.S. look good either, and it's disastrous for Mali. My point is, we need to do a very thorough review to find out exactly what happened. From this distance, that's all I can recommend, because there are details I don't know.
Sure. And you know, I wanted to know about the, what you thought about the people that are running right now for president. We've actually met a number of them, and I know we have a whole Malian delegation here that I look forward to meeting with as soon as this meeting is over. But how many people are running for president? I think I've met 2 or 3 presidential candidates who've come through the Capitol. And what is their, you know, what's your opinion of the capacity?
You know, I think my definitive answer is I've heard of 12 running. I know that at least 1 is a woman, which is a good sign. On the other hand, as Chairman Smith had asked about the elections, I see the value of the elections. On the other hand, I am nervous because between now and July is not a lot of time.
Right.
And so the way I'm linking this to your question is that there doesn't seem to be a lot of time to get to know the candidates, at least from people from like us from the outside. Now, the talk inside Mali is that many of the candidates are from the old political class, so they may be well known, but for an activist like me, what I know is fairly superficial, which is that there are about 12 of them, and they are vying, and I wish there was more time to do things right.
Well, and I also think it's going to be interesting, and Mr. Chair, maybe it's something that we could look at, because after the election takes place, what is our role going to be in supporting whoever it is, you know, that is elected to help to strengthen their capacity? A final question for you. When I was making one of my runs back to another committee, you were talking about drug trafficking, and I wanted to know if you could expand on that. And I wanted to know your thoughts on how you think countries in the region can best counter the drug trafficking.
If I may take the back end of the question first, because in preparing for this testimony and some of the research I was doing, one thing struck me which I think is a good sign, and I will underline that. Former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan has actually just in January created a West Africa Commission on Drugs, and is bringing a lot of Africans, including former President Obasanjo, to deal with the drug problem in West Africa. Now, what I was saying earlier is that the way I think it affects U.S. interests is that these drugs, the experts mentioned that you have cocaine, you have meth, and you have heroin. The cocaine is coming from Latin America, And in return, what you are getting back into Latin America, of course, is drug money, but you are also getting some of the weapons that everyone agrees flowed out of Libya. So you are getting weapons going to Latin America. And I'm saying that it seems to me that happening in the U.S. Hemisphere should be of concern to the U.S. But apart from cocaine, the research and the UN Office on Drugs has also done a lot of work in West Africa. And they are finding out the meth is being produced in some West African countries and then exported to East Asia. And then heroin is coming from Asia through West Africa into Europe. And the big problem this is having on the area, West Africa, is three. You've got corruption, you've got democracy being contaminated, and then you've got health problems because people involved in the drug trade, locals, sometimes they are being paid with drugs, and so consumption is also growing, and it is a health problem for the Africans, and they are very concerned. I mean, one thing Kofi Annan said was that we really need the help of our friends in Europe and the United States to help us deal with the drug problem.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. You've been very patient with your time. If I could just ask a few final questions, and anything you want to add, please do. You know, in my walk as a lawmaker, and I've been in Congress now 33 years, I often differentiate between criticism that mocks and belittles, that is cheap shots, and criticism that is constructive and leads to better outcomes. I would ask you and invite you, you did listen to the administration witnesses earlier in the first panel. You know and you understand the administration's policies vis-a-vis the Sahel. I wonder if you could offer this panel any constructive criticism that might lead to better outcomes, number one. Secondly, and Mr. Atala, in your testimony, you heard Nancy Lindborg say earlier that while the recent rise of violent extremism in West Africa cannot be directly attributed to drought, chronic food security, or weak governance, each of these factors can indirectly exacerbate instability in the region. And you made three very specific recommendations at the end of your testimony. One is that USAID get back into the fight, and you pointed out that there are access restrictions, which our embassy imposes and others impose. If you could elaborate on that. Secondly, you talk about border security. I wonder if you might tell us to what degree are you talking about? How much, you know, is it technical aid? Is it actual foreign aid that would beef up their ability to have a more secure border? And finally, you've pointed out that to effectively counter the jihad narrative wielded by AQIM, a comprehensive and expertly crafted information operation campaign is necessary for the region. And that is, I think, a very profound recommendation, but I wonder if you might tell us how that might be done, and others might want to speak to that as well. But the first one will be on constructive criticism, and then to speak to the three or elaborate on the recommendations that you made.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, constructive criticism, I think sir, I think you asked a question is, what is AFRICOM doing? A component of AFRICOM is SOCAV. Though I think SOCAV can be deeply rooted in the fight, but with restrictions, we're not taking enough steps. I know the command is ready. I know the command wants to go in. I know they have several plans to go in. However, there are some political dynamics that prohibit them from doing so. And my first criticism is I think we need to get in there. There could be some assistance in targeting key AQIM, Mujau, Ansar ad-Din leaders, Iyad Aghali, Mukhtar Bal-Mukhtar, I can go on and on. There are several of them that are still floating around the region, and we have experience in other parts of the world that we can bring to bear in this area. That's number one. Number two, although AID is doing some work, a lot more can be done. Again, in the band of the Sahara, and when I talk about northern Mali, northern Niger, southern Libya, southern Algeria, all the way across to northern Chad, the peoples of this part of the world are really marginalized by their host governments. And a call from Kidal, for example, a person was telling me that there is very little food resources, and medical resources. Médecins du Monde, which is an NGO that provides some medical aid, has a couple of workers up in Kidal, but not enough to meet all the needs. We need to get those folks up there. In order to do so, it requires, of course, soft elements to provide that security. So that is, in a sense, a criticism of the lack of involvement in the region. In answer to the questions you asked specifically to my statement, I've flown across the entire band of the Sahara. I used to do that for the Defense Intelligence Agency. I've landed on every dirt strip in the northern parts of the Sahara, from Mali, Niger, and Chad. There's no radar. Movements of aircraft can go back and forth. People can land, say, in Kidal. They can land in Tessalit. They can land in other parts of the Sahara, literally without anybody knowing about it. Number two, the movements across the Sahara in some of these difficult areas, because geographically, if you take the highest peaks of the mountains in, say, southern Algeria, the Ahagar Mountains, into the Adrars in Mali and the Air Mountains in Niger, that band over there has some very treacherous terrain. And people move very freely within those areas. It's very difficult for the host countries to have any visibility or control. So we need to do that, in effect. In terms of messaging, AQIM is very apt. Like I said, they have a Twitter account, and they've used Facebook continuously. There was a Facebook page, and I mentioned that in my written statement, that popped up after the attack on the gas plant in Algeria. Mukhtar Belmokhtar, the guy who crafted the strategy for its face, went on Facebook on a site called the Derna Media Center, which stands for Derna, Libya. Within a matter of weeks, it was taken down. But the number of people that joined that, literally in a 2-week span, was 4,000, basically touting Mukhtar Belmokhtar as a hero of what he did in Algeria. It doesn't mean all these people are joining AQIM. However, it means that they're getting an audience, whether it's through Twitter, it's through Facebook, or whatnot. What we need to do is counter that in order to prevent additional recruits in the future and to prevent things like we're seeing right now in Mali, suicide bombers.
You mentioned Mukhtar. I thought he was killed.
Ma'am, he wasn't killed. That was a mention from the Chadian side. The Chadian president came out and said that he was killed, but Mukhtar Belmokhtar is still alive. In fact, jihadi forums came out and did say publicly that he is still alive. The only person who is confirmed killed, and the French had to confirm it publicly, was Abu Zaid. There are several others, but Mukhtar Belmokhtar is still around.
Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.
I think we just really have to ask ourselves the very basic question, and that is it the illness we're going after or the symptoms? This, fighting terrorism, fighting the Mukhtars by whatever name is a little bit like that game. You have the groundhog that comes up, you smash its head here, and it pops up here, you smash it here, it pops up there. It's never ending. I mean, if one does not get in there and treat that hunger and that poverty and that desperation, you just simply cannot win the war. You cannot. So the question then becomes, well, yes, this has to be done. Can we and how do we get to the real root issues so that in the end, it's the people living in that area, it's their leaderships that have to come back forward and say, okay, what are we going to do to really stabilize? We're not going to stabilize. They're going to have to stabilize it. I mean, let's be honest in the end. What is the only answer there? It's almost, I was chuckling earlier, reminiscent of my grandmother when I was studying political philosophy, and, she said, what I mean by this is, the grandmother from the old Yugoslavia, this is very brilliant. You guys are all very wise. He said, but can I spread this on bread and eat it? Can I do that? That wisdom of yours? And there's too much at times that we focus elections, and there's going to be a discussion. I mean, I don't even want to count how many national dialogues have gone on in various countries on this continent. But when do we get on? When does the civil society and the people all say, hey, what about us? We want to eat. We want to grow up like the rest of the world is going forward. So really, I think that focus has got to come also from the people themselves, their own national leadership, to pull out what is, in the end, the absolute necessity, and that is treat that symptom, treat the disease, not the symptom. It is poverty, it is hunger, it is desperation, and that is where, if there's a positive criticism, it's a realization from the development agency and others. There's been no surprise. There's a drought every so many years. There's instability every so many years, Sahel. We could have predicted everything that's been happening. The issue is recognize it and then or deal with it with the amount of time it's necessary. If it's 20 years, if it's these kind of resources, recognize what it is and do it, or say, you know what, we can't do it. That's the reality to me. Over. Thank you.
Thank you again, Mr. Chairman. If in terms of constructive, if I might I call it constructive suggestion. You know, if you look, Mali was very important in terms of U.S. security activities in the region prior to the war and the coup. And since then, clearly the French and the Europeans have a heavier presence. My suggestion then will be for the U.S. to say, look, we weren't here just to kill our enemies, and if some other soldiers are here, then we are not interested. It should be actually, I would like the U.S. to send a message to the Malians and the regions that we want to play a big role in your reconstruction and your recovery. So that will be that the U.S. should have a bigger presence. I did a little calculation of the pledges in Brussels, and from what I can tell, based on what the U.S. has already put down and then requests that they have made to Congress, and I could have gotten some things wrong, but it's about a 5% contribution to what has been pledged for Mali. I wish it was more. And secondly, in terms of specific things, again, I think Mali, because it is the test case, what the U.S. does with Mali sends a message to the rest of the region, and I will say the elections. Again, I think there are worrisome signs. I don't think the elections can be stopped or rolled back, but I do think that there should be a contingency plan for quickly reacting and helping the Malians make sure that it goes well. And finally, my big point, which is that we need to do a review to say, over these years and with Libya and Mali haven't happened, what have we learned? How can we re-engage the region to have security? Because security comes first and good governance comes first, and other things will follow. Thank you again.
Thank you very much for your testimonies. Thank you for your insights and counsel. It is very helpful to the committees that have met to receive it, and we will follow up on it. So I thank you so very much. I would also ask unanimous consent that a written testimony from Shari Brennenbach, the President and CEO of the United States African Development Foundation, be made a part of the record. I again want to thank Speaker Touré for being here for the entirety of the hearing. We often have visiting diplomats and even speakers like yourself. This is the first time, and this is about my 400th hearing, that we've ever had a speaker come and stay and listen to the entirety of the proceeding. You do us a great honor by doing so. I want to thank you for your ambassador, Mamoun Keita, who's been a great help over the years and will continue to be, I'm sure. And again, I want to thank our witnesses. Your testimonies were extraordinary. Hearing is adjourned.